Fabelmans. So even though this is a fairly obvious statement, we all know that Steven Spielberg is arguably one of the greatest filmmakers in cinema history, and he has been classed as the so-called greatest cinematic storyteller of all time, because we've seen so many brilliant films from him over the years, beginning back to the early to mid 1970s with Duel and Jaws, and throughout that time he's made some more brilliant films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the Indiana Jones franchise, Schindler's List, Jurassic Park, and in more recent times he's done some other really good films as well, including War Horse, the biopic about Abraham Lincoln, Bridge of Spies, the BFG, Ready Player One, and the West Side Story remake. And this one is definitely the most different than anything that we've seen from him before, because when you think and reflect on a lot of filmmakers over the years who have done some very self-indulgent projects, such as Quentin Tarantino, Guillermo del Toro, Darren Aronofsky, and amongst others, and that's largely down to the fact they like to express their personality and their opinions or thoughts through these films. And Steven Spielberg over the years hasn't done any of that really, because he's done adaptation after adaptation after adaptation after adaptation of books, of plays, and all those things, and arguably his films have actually done better than the original source. But here Steven Spielberg goes self-indulgent because this film is about him. It's about his youth and his origins of how he got into cinema, and it gives us a little insight into his family. And you may think to yourself that yeah, it's another director who's very self-indulgent and that he's telling his story, but I feel, because as I said about the adaptations that he's done over the years, if there's any filmmaker who deserves to tell his own story, it is Steven Spielberg. And in 2022 we've had a lot of films that have been tributes and very self-indulgent projects about films, like Damien Chazelle's Babylon and Sam Mendes' Empire of Light. But the thing that I was mainly thinking about going into this, how is Steven Spielberg going to create his own story that would make it cinematically entertaining? Because he probably had to make a few adjustments to the film because of how it would represent his family, and just also what he did genuinely go through throughout his childhood. So growing up in post-World War II Arizona, young Sammy Fabelman aspires to become a filmmaker as he reaches adolescence, but soon discovers a shattering family secret and explores how the power of films can help him see the truth. So as I said, the film is semi-autobiographical that focuses on Steven Spielberg's childhood, and he tells the story of how he fell in love with cinema through this Sammy Fabelman character, but also showed the audience the power of it and how influential it can be. So essentially it's like Steven Spielberg going full circle really. And structurally it is a traditional coming of age story that follows this young boy as he's growing up with his family, and it has a kind of similar feel, I found, to Richard Linklater's Boyhood, because we are seeing this boy grow up while at the same time we are focusing on the family's journey as well. And I think what I found with this film, even though we know that the main person is Sammy Fabelman, there was equally a little bit of confusion in terms of who the main character was between Sammy or his mother, because the protagonist of the story got lost in translation at times, because we followed Sam's story while also his mother's as well. And I felt that there were times where it lacked a little bit of structure and a little bit of direction, and you could argue that was Steven Spielberg's intention, because adolescence is unpredictable and also just general life is as well. But I do think the narrative representation of Steven Spielberg's homage to cinema was absolutely stunning. I mean, just some of those opening moments in the film were absolutely brilliant. I loved the sequence in which Sammy's parents take him to see The Greatest Show on Earth, and he sees that famous train crash sequence, and then afterwards through one of the cameras that he has, he reenacts that. And it does make me wonder to a certain degree as to how true a lot of the events in this film really are, especially regarding Spielberg's love for film and the reason why he chose to show specific films. Maybe he was inspired by The Greatest Show on Earth, but I think for just the sentiment of it, because of course it's called The Greatest Show on Earth and that films can present the greatest shows on Earth, that for the purpose of introducing the characters, the sentiment was there. And ironically, it's a film that films film sequences really well, because as well as being a homage to film, it has certain production techniques that are also like a tribute to certain movements within cinema history. For example, the French New Wave movement that started in the 1950s, and that focused on some film critics from France who were inspired to become filmmakers on low budgets. And their films were shot on location, and they had improvised narratives, and also had a very unique and bizarre approach to editing. In that sense, I think Steven Spielberg pays tribute to certain filmmakers from that particular period, such as Jean-Luc Godard and Francois Truffaut. And I thought production-wise, the cinematography was just absolutely amazing, and it completely justified the awe-inspiring art of film and the power that it has on influencing the audience. I mean, there was one shot that was particularly special, and that was of Sammy as a child placing his hand in front of the cinematic projection, which is symbolic to him having literally the rest of his life and the power of cinema in the palm of his hands. So I love the symbolism on that. Now, as well as the unique approach to the narrative, there was something about the acting that was very different in terms of how the actors were going about the roles that they were playing. Because I just think to myself, imagine being one of the actors performing in this film. And I'm sure there are a lot of actors who get very nervous in portraying real life people in biopics, especially if they're still alive. But I think when you're being directed by somebody whose story that the film is based on, it raises the stakes a whole lot more, because these lot are having to perform in front of Steven Spielberg while being directed by Steven Spielberg in a film about Steven Spielberg. I mean, the acting in any Spielberg film will raise expectations, but this just takes it to a whole new level. And it does take some pretty special talents to be able to pull this off. So like I said, the Fabelman family are based on the Spielberg family. And in the role of aspiring filmmaker is young actor Gabriel Labelle. And I thought, despite the potential intimidation that he felt going into this film, I thought he did a very good job, because it was his job to justify and tell Steven Spielberg's story, while at the same time looking at it from the perspective of any other actor going into any film, by just going off a script that's been written for the screen. And I can imagine Sam Fabelman is a character that's a lot like how Steven Spielberg was growing up, not just for the love of film, not just with relationships with his family, but also the anti-Semitism that he had to go through. But I did really like Gabrielle Labelle's performance in this. We also had Michelle Williams as Mitzi Fabelman, who is of course based on Steven Spielberg's mother Leah, and you got the impression from this character that she was a devoted and loving mother to her children, while also as the film progressed you kind of got an understanding that she may have suffered from some kind of mental health issue. And that was something that was touched upon, but it wasn't really elaborated on. And I'll go back to my point earlier about how we didn't always know who the protagonist was. And I think if Spielberg did go down that route about her mental health, then I think it would kind of lose track of who the main character was, and that it was about mental health rather than about filmmaking. Because if it was blended into the story and told from Sam's perspective, then it might have worked, and I think that's what it did overall do. And I think the representation of this character is interesting because it's based on Steven Spielberg's mother. I don't think he wanted to paint this unfair picture of her, and I don't think he did personally, because I think the character is ultimately showed as this woman who, yes, is very devoted to her children, while at the same time she does have her own flaws, like every parent does, like every child does. And I thought Michelle Williams' performance in this was really good, and she does deserve an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. Whether she'll win or not, I don't think she will, but she was deserving a nomination nonetheless. And in the role of the father was Paul Dano as Bert Fabelman, and he's based on Spielberg's father Arnold, who was an electrical engineer. And while I do feel that Paul Dano slightly lacked that paternal instinct in this character, he still did play an integral part in giving us a glimpse of that Steven Spielberg family history. And I thought he did have good chemistry with Michelle Williams in this film. Also, in a very different light, we saw Seth Rogen as Benny, who is Bert's best friend and is like the family uncle. And this was very different for Seth Rogen actually, because it was somewhat normal for him, because we're used to seeing him in very comedic roles, but this one was very different, where he was just perceived as this normal man, and that's exactly what he was in this, and I thought he did a really good job. Veteran actor Judd Hirsch also makes an appearance, as well as Boris, who's Sammy's great uncle, and he actually received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, which is actually quite surprising considering how brief his role was. And even though there were some actors who I felt deserved the nomination more than he did, I still think he was good. And a rather unexpected but brilliant casting in this film that I really liked was David Lynch as John Ford. Now, from one unorthodox filmmaking icon in David Lynch to playing another legendary filmmaker of the golden age in John Ford, David Lynch is a filmmaker who was of Steven Spielberg's era. It's about as close to Spielberg appearing in this film and telling his own story on screen, with David Lynch as John Ford. So I thought that was a really nice touch as well. So overall, as expected, The Fabelmans is truly a wonderful tribute to cinema. And even though it got lost a little bit at times in terms of who the main character was, I think Steven Spielberg's vision for this film really did justify and give us a real insight into what his youth was like. And it's a weird one because we know that Steven Spielberg is way into his 70s now, and I'm sure he's got a lot of films left in him. I also kind of felt that this was almost like his goodbye film, because there was something about The Fabelmans that had a little bit of closure about it, because the film is obviously personal to Steven Spielberg, but because he's made film after film after film after film over the years, this one is almost like it's a celebration of his career, as well as a story about his youth. So this film really does go full circle, and I'm really glad that Steven Spielberg got to tell his story through this film. What did you think of The Fabelmans? Did you find it a very honourable tribute to cinema? What did you think about the representations of Steven Spielberg's family through the characters? Or did you find it a little bit too self-indulgent and it wasn't really worth anything at all? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, if you did go on to enjoy this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and to have a notification bell ticked so you're notified when I upload a new video. and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, everybody.